Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here today. It's an important day here in Minneapolis, and we have some thoughts to share with you. I'm happy to be joined by some of the great leaders in the state of Minnesota. Of course, I've got Congressman Steve Stauber here with me from Minnesota's 8th District. I have Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach from Minnesota's 7th District, and former prosecutor and one of our all-star candidates who's going to win a seat for us for the Republican Party in the House, Joe Tairab, who's running in Minnesota's 2nd District. These are important voices at an important time, and we are here in Minneapolis for one reason. It is our job to expose the real records of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. The American people are hurting because this situation is really desperate. We're all paying more for gasoline and groceries and rent and car payments and mortgages. And we've watched millions and millions of illegal aliens come right across that open border into our communities, draining our resources and attacking American citizens. And each one of those crimes have been 100% preventable. Those illegals should never have been here in the first place. But the Biden-Harris administration opened the border wide. Wars, meanwhile, are breaking out all around the world. And we've seen spikes in crime in cities like here in Minneapolis across the country for the last 4 years. In spite of all that, Kamala Harris and Democrats are trying to tell us that none of this is happening. They're trying to tell us that we're wrong for the things that we can see with our own two eyes and that we're all feeling. They're telling you that not to believe what you experience every day. They're telling you the economy is actually good. They're telling you that illegal aliens don't commit crimes. It's the largest gaslighting operation in the history of American politics, and it's as absurd as it is offensive. This is not some kind of political game. Harris and the Democrats have destabilized our country, and they have put the American people in the most dangerous situation that we have faced since World War II. 4 more years of these policies are simply unthinkable. But after being in control and in power for the last 4 years, they spent their entire Democrat National Convention blaming Donald Trump for their failures. And Kamala Harris says, don't worry about it. She says, don't worry. All these important issues will be solved on day 1 of her administration. It's a total charade. She expects the American people to look the other way and pretend as though she is not the sitting vice president of the United States. She should fix all these problems right now, but she is unable and unwilling to do so. She won't ever do so. The American people have suffered through 3.5 horrible years of Kamala Harris's agenda, and we cannot afford 4 more of those. It's no wonder why, after 35 days since she was given the Democrat coronation as the nominee, despite not receiving a single vote, Kamala Harris has refused to do a serious news interview or to take questions from voters. Yet, while she hides from the media, we are here and we are telling the important story about the facts. This is about facts over fantasy. It's about record over rhetoric. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's records are absolutely horrible. The building behind me stands as one enduring symbol of those destructive records, and Minneapolis is a very important part of this story. It was 4 years ago that this police precinct, the 3rd precinct, right behind us, and this entire neighborhood were burned, including the Target store across the street and family businesses like the Hexagon that had been a part of this community since the 1930s. Overall, more than 1,500 buildings in the city of Minneapolis here and the surrounding area were damaged or destroyed, totaling upwards of $500 million in damages. Right here, the hopes and dreams of countless small business owners and families literally went up in smoke. And as you can see from the charred and barricaded building right behind us here, 4 years later, this community still has not recovered from the aftermath. But it didn't have to be this way. It's about the leadership. Look, we all recognize that peaceful protests are protected by our Constitution, and that's no different for those that happened after the murder of George Floyd. But when the protest turned into violent, destructive riots here in Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz enabled them. Tim Walz and Democrats in Minnesota allowed Minneapolis to burn for nearly an entire day before doing anything at all. And this, of course, was after rioters had taken over the 3rd precinct right here behind me, and fires burned across the city. During that dangerous time, Tim Walz failed his people. And under his tenure, these are some very important, very raw facts. The police force here shrunk by nearly 40%. Violent crimes surged 30%. Murders in Minneapolis surged 73%. Nearly 50,000 people left Minnesota between 2020 and 2022, and the impacts continue to linger. Minneapolis has seen increases in property damage, motor vehicle theft, and aggravated assault this year compared to just last year. And while Tim Walz let Minnesota burn, it was Kamala Harris who poured gasoline on the flames by helping to bail out those who held the matches. 5 days after the riots began, and there were millions of dollars in destruction, Kamala Harris helped raise money not for the people whose businesses were being destroyed or the livelihoods ruined, but for the criminals who destroyed them. Overall, Kamala supported funds paid bail for a twice-convicted rapist, a man accused of sexually assaulting an 18-year-old girl, and a serial domestic abuser. In fact, a number of those. One man freed by the fund even went on to commit murder. Tragically, Harris's actions supporting this fund were par for the course for the weak-on-crime radical Democrats who have reduced penalties for violent crimes. They have pushed to end cash bail and decriminalize illegal border crossings and pushed to defund the police across our country. The riots that began here and Kamala Harris's endorsement of them set off a summer of love, as the radical and anarchists described it, but it was really a summer of destruction. And we will not forget that, and the American people will not forget that. But it's not just crime where Kamala Harris and Tim Walz failed the American people. It's impossible to ignore the economy. Since January 2021, the average Minnesota household has had to pay more than $1,200 more per month for living expenses. That's due to their inflation. Overall, prices here in Minneapolis are up 22% from the start of Walz's tenure, just as prices are up 20% nationally under Kamala Harris. It's clear that Harris and Walz think they can trick the American people into supporting them, but the people are smarter than that. They know exactly what's going on. Tim Walz talks about freedom and minding your own business in his convention speech. What a joke. He is the governor that set up the snitch line during COVID for neighbors to tell on each other if somebody dared to go on their front porch for a breath of fresh air. It's now documented that Tim Walz embellished his military record, and he used that to get elected over and over. Tim Walz praised big government socialism. He opposed construction of the border wall. He supports allowing boys and girls sports and the mutilation of children without parental consent. He opposes voter ID. He signed a bill allowing convicted felons to vote before their probation or parole ended. And he wants to give driver's license to the millions of illegal migrants that Kamala Harris has allowed into our country. From their records on the riots and crime to the economy to woke ideology and to the border, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are simply too extreme for the American people. Could this country survive this team of San Francisco radicals and big government socialists? Could we survive 4 years of them in charge of our domestic and foreign policy? Heaven help us. I'm going to turn it over to these leaders here locally who can tell you a little bit more about this. And the first that I'll turn it over to is Minnesota's Congressman Pete Stauber from the 8th District. Pete?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pete Stauber. I have the privilege of representing Minnesota's 8th Congressional District, which is Northeast Minnesota. I spent 23 years as a police officer, 22 of them in my hometown of Duluth. In 2020, it was devastating to watch Minneapolis burn, and it was devastating to watch this 3rd precinct being taken over by rioters and violent protesters. When the governor and other elected leaders said, quote, "let them take it," that hurt law enforcement, not only in Minnesota, but across this nation. We all saw the officers running down this alley, heading up 2 blocks for safety, leaving this precinct. That set the tone for the nation and the world. As my brothers and sisters in the blue and brown were being assaulted violently, being shot at, Kamala Harris was trying to raise money to bail those same violent protesters out, to continue the devastation in this community. I will say to the residents of Minneapolis, to the business owners of Minneapolis, and to the police officers, the men and women in the Minneapolis Police Department. They failed you, and it's unacceptable. The recruitment, retention, morale of law enforcement is as low as it's ever been. Law enforcement is an honorable, noble profession, and we want more great men and women to come in and serve their communities. I will tell you, I have been a victim of 2 violent gun crimes. And during those protests, when our officers were being shot at, they should have been arrested and put in jail, not bailed out by somebody who now wants to be our commander-in-chief. And as Minneapolis was burning, Tim Walz put his finger in the air and tried to figure out which way the political winds were blowing. And we know that because afterwards he says it was an abject failure. He admitted that he failed. Abject failure. We can do better. Minneapolis families, the police officers, our community members deserve safety and deserve somebody when you have to make a decision, you make that decision with the best information you have. And by the way, when Governor Walz was asked why didn't he bring in the National Guard, part of his comments were, and I quote, "They were just a bunch of 19-year-old cooks," end quote. Those were his words. I can tell you, as a military family and a wife who served in the 148th Fighter Wing for over 23 years, that is an insult. Those men and women are trained, they're our community members. And you know what, Governor Walz? The Minnesota National Guard needs 19-year-old cooks. Their value to the organizations and the missions that we ask them to do. As we move forward, we need steady leadership. We need somebody that will back the blue. As police officers, we want to be held accountable. We will be held accountable. But we also have to have elected officials from the local level, the state level, and the federal level to back the blue. There is only one candidate and vice presidential candidate that backs the blue, and that's Donald J. Trump and J.D. Vance, without question. I've met law enforcement officers from across this nation. Almost all of them are disappointed in the behavior of our governor during the riots and Kamala Harris trying to bail the rioters out so they could assault our police officers and our community members. We need Donald J. Trump back in office, who supports the police, supports public safety, and will make our nation and our community safer. So with that being said, I want to now introduce my good colleague and friend, Representative Michelle Fischbach.
Well, thank you very much. And as a lifelong Minnesotan, I watched, along with other Minnesotans, as Minneapolis burned. I watched as Governor Walz did nothing to stop it. And I watched as Governor Walz deserted law enforcement and gave up the 3rd Precinct. I watched as Governor Walz let law enforcement down and let the people of Minnesota down. And then we watched as Kamala Harris put together bail money for those rioters. The riots in Minnesota show what a Harris-Walz administration would do. They will let law enforcement down. They will disrespect law enforcement. They will let the people of our country down. I am grateful to be here today with Speaker Johnson, and he told you about those things, about what a Harris-Walz administration would do. And we will point out the harm that Governor Walz has done to public safety in Minnesota. We need to elect President Trump, and I'm incredibly proud to be here today with Joe Tarab, who will put public safety as a priority when he is elected. He will put law enforcement as a priority when he is elected. He will put the safety of Minnesotans as a priority. And I am proud to be here today with him because these are the kinds of people that we need to elect to make sure that Congress is doing what we need to ensure the safety of the people of Minnesota. And I am proud to be here and introduce Joe as our next congressman from Minnesota's 2nd District.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman Fischbach, and thank you, Speaker Johnson, for being here. This is extremely sobering to be here in front of the 3rd Precinct, but it's also personal to me. I'm the proud son of an immigrant from Sudan, but also my mom grew up in Minneapolis here. And so this is personal to me, not only because of that, but also because of what my job was for 4 years as a federal prosecutor at the United States Attorney's Office. You know, Tim Walz sat on his hands for days and let our city burn, and people like in my office and myself had to fill that gap. We had to charge people who threw Molotov cocktails into a courthouse like I did in the 2nd District, or 2 criminals who tried to burn down a small mom and pop small business over in St. Paul and ransack places like Target that we're just a few feet from away right now. But I think a microcosm of the power vacuum that Tim Walz created is a place at the George Floyd Square at 38th in Chicago, just about a mile west of here. That's a place where these radical criminal protesters took over the George Floyd Square. They created an autonomous zone. They blocked out law enforcement. And wouldn't you know, crime went up. 7 murders in the George Floyd Square. Widespread drug trafficking. And we had to charge those Bloods criminal street gang members that went into that void that was created by Tim Walz and his enablers. And one of those Bloods criminal street gang members that I charged and that we charged as a team was Michael Burrell, who's going to stand trial here in a few weeks here in Minnesota. And Michael Burrell's brother is Mayan Burrell. I want to focus on Mayan Burrell because he's also a microcosm of the failure of Tim Walz. Mayan Burrell, as many people here might know, shot and killed an 11-year-old girl, Taisha Edwards, in North Minneapolis. She was caught in the crossfire of a gang shooting. Mayan Burrell was convicted, sentenced to a life term of imprisonment in prison. And then after the calls of the defund the police movement, he was eventually commuted. His sentence was commuted by none other than Tim Walz, a murderer who was set free by Tim Walz. And Mayan Burrell was set free. And what did he do after just being off of probation for 3 months? He went back into crime. He got caught with a gun and drugs right here in the Twin Cities. You know what? You think a guy like that, a murderer who was released by Tim Walz, maybe he shouldn't be set free. Well, you know who thought otherwise was the Minnesota Freedom Fund, the fund that Kamala Harris was soliciting funds for during the riots. Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and the people that enable them, like my opponent, Angie Craig, who's a lockstep for the failed Biden-Harris agenda, that's what's caused this mess, a power vacuum. We need to end that. We're going to end that on day one when we elect Donald J. Trump as president. We're going to end that on day one when we grow the Republican House majority. And that's why I'm proud to be in the fight. I'm proud to be the fight next to Congressman Stauber and Congresswoman Fischbach, and especially our leader, Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your leadership, Speaker Johnson.
Well, we'll conclude this by just reminding you and take a couple questions, but remind you that, again, this election is about fact over fantasy. It's about record over rhetoric. And every single American voter needs to ask themselves, are me and my family going to be more safe, more secure, more prosperous under the Trump-Vance ticket or under the Harris-Walz ticket? And if you look at the record and you look at the past is prologue. If you look at what these people have actually done in office, the answer to that is crystal clear. As Speaker of the House, I've now traveled to 191 cities across 39 states so far, doing campaign events for our candidates and our incumbents. And it doesn't matter where we go around the country, people are absolutely fed up with the way that things are. As I meet with families and police officers, as I have done here in Minneapolis, I meet with veterans, I meet with business owners across this country. They hear their concerns. One thing is absolutely clear. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are too extreme for America. Their records here in Minneapolis and in the White House have shown us all the proof that we need. The choice in this election could not be clearer. Here are some more undisputable facts. Remember, fact over fantasy. The facts are that under President Donald Trump, our border was secure. Our streets were safer. Our economy was the strongest in history for every community. Our allies respected us and our enemies feared us. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are running to fix our broken economy, to secure that border once and for all, and put us back on a path to peace through strength. Unlike the woke left, they have the backs of every hardworking American citizen. So do the Republicans in Congress. And especially we have the backs of our law enforcement, and our voters know it. Working together, and because of great House incumbents and candidates like Joe Tayrab, I am confident that we are going to grow our House majority. I believe very strongly that we are going to win back Republican control of the Senate, and I believe that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are going to be headed to the White House. And despite what the mainstream media says, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's radical records make our path to grow the majority even easier. And when we do, we'll work day in and day out to deliver solutions that American families desperately need from our leadership right now. To all the brave Americans who serve in law enforcement, let us just conclude here today by saying this. We hear you, we support you as we always have, and we stand with you against the onslaught of attacks that you take every day as you risk your lives to serve these communities. And to the people of Minneapolis and cities just like this across America, we will not stand for lawlessness and soft on crime policies and a crippling economy. We'll continue to speak out about the radical and disastrous records of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and come November, with President Trump and with a new Republican Senate, we will begin our urgent work in earnest to make America great again. With that, if you have a couple questions, we'll take them now. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Yes, the projections for the outcome of the House races are favoring Republicans right now. We believe that we are going to grow the majority, and part of our belief is based upon the fact that we have extraordinary candidates like Joe Tayrab. You just heard a little sample of his expertise and his background. This is a serious leader for serious times. He's been a prosecutor. He's served his country in uniform. He has an extraordinary record, and contrasted with these other leaders, like the ones that were on parade at the Democrat convention, you see people who will handle the crime crisis, who will handle the economy, and who will bring thoughtful, common sense solutions to all the great challenges facing the country. Joe's run an extraordinary race. I believe he's going to beat Angie Craig handily, because he's been going into the community and talking with people, not only providing the answers to all these great challenges, but doing it with the right tone, the right measure. He's exactly the kind of leader we need for times like this. We could not be more proud of him as a candidate, and others like him that we recruited all across the country. This is an extraordinary stable. I believe we put on the field the best slate of candidates that we've had in our party in the modern era, and I believe that's going to pay off on Election Day. Yes, ma'am. It is. With regard to the polls, I mean, obviously the Democrats are on a sugar high. Everybody's acknowledged that, and I think that gets real after Labor Day. If you look over the history of all presidential election years, I mean, that's when people really begin to pay attention. So the rhetoric and the little bounce they get out of the convention is always expected. But I think that Kamala Harris is about to be put to the real test. She's stuck to the teleprompters pretty carefully, as you've noticed, since she was coronated. As we noted, she's not done a serious interview, and she's not submitted to questions from the media, but she can't do that for the next 70 days. And I think that the more people hear from her, the less and less confidence they will have, and the more alarmed they'll be by her actual record. And that's what we're here to highlight today. I think these polls are going to change pretty dramatically for the next 70 days, and I believe that we're going to be victorious on Election Day because the stakes are so very high, and everybody recognizes that around the country. With regard to the Oversight Committee, I do think it's an appropriate thing for them to be looking into. The House Oversight Committee has a pretty broad jurisdiction, and one of the things that they're tasked with doing is safeguarding the American people, looking into to things that are questionable. And with regard to China, That's our closest peer-to-peer adversary right now. China is our greatest national security threat next to the national debt, and we have to take it very seriously. And the allegations that have been made against Tim Walz are quite serious. He has seemingly, on the surface, he seems to have quite a bit of connections to China. He's certainly traveled there a lot, seems to really aspire to their policies, and that Marxist socialist ideology is something that I think is going to alarm the American people when they understand what it really means and what his connection is. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that we're all very alarmed about is that Tim Walz not only supports the wide open border, obviously, by his actions and his statements, but he also, through his policies and his practices, he has created this state as a magnet. He has offered benefits to seemingly invite illegals to come into this state. And I think the people of this state are quite frustrated by it. I know they are all around the country. We say that every border is a border state now, and it's certainly true. And by our count, I actually believe the number of illegals who have come across that border since Harris took over as the border czar is close to 16 million people. Now, these aren't huddled masses of families seeking, fleeing persecution in their home country, needing asylum. These are, in many cases, very dangerous people, as President Trump keeps pointing out. We went down to the Eagle Pass, the Del Rio sector in South Texas in January, brought the largest collection of members of Congress ever. We were down there and we heard directly from those in charge of border security and our Border Patrol agents. They told us that 70% of the people that crossed illegally at Eagle Pass, which is the epicenter, were single adult males between the ages of 18 and 45. We have tens of thousands of Chinese nationalists. We have obviously hundreds of people who are on the terrorism watch list. We've got dangerous criminals from other countries. All that is true. And now we're seeing the effect of it, the violent crime that's being committed against Americans. We have fentanyl poisoning as the #1 cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 49. I mean, all of these untold catastrophes were totally foreseeable and totally preventable. But Harris, the border czar, and Joe Biden refused to close the border when they could have done it every single day. And governors like Tim Walz have invited the problem. They have incentivized illegal crossing, and they've encouraged people to come into their states and effectively invade these communities with all this danger and violence. It's a serious thing. I think the American people are going to make them pay a price for that in November. That bill was terribly flawed. It was not a border security bill. It was an immigration policy bill. We do need to fix the immigration system, but you need bipartisan support from both chambers of Congress to work that out because it's very complicated. What we need immediately, first and foremost, what the American people demand and deserve, is to secure the border. And then let's talk about immigration policy and how to solve the problems that that's created. That bill that was sent to us would have codified some of the terrible practices that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the border czar, put into place. That's why we could not have supported that. It would have actually made the problem worse. So there will be a comprehensive immigration reform, I believe, coming in the next Congress. But the first thing we'll do on day one is secure that border. Donald Trump will do it with executive orders the moment he walked into the Oval Office, and we will back it up immediately thereafter with some of the strongest border security legislation you've ever seen. We passed H.R. 2. That policy, that secure our border legislation 17 months ago in the House. And it's been sitting on Chuck Schumer's desk collecting dust. The Democrats and the border czar Kamala Harris do not want to close the border because their hope, I believe all along, has been to turn illegals into voters. That's a whole other issue, and we're working on voter security, and we need the states to ensure that illegals are not going to unlawfully register to vote and participate in this election. We passed the SAVE Act before we left for the August district work period, and 198 House Democrats voted against that, including Angie Craig. That's something that I think everybody needs to take note of, and I think they will at the election day. Thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Good job, Mr. Speaker. Thanks for coming up.